Thanks everyone for joining us on this lovely Thursday afternoon. I see the sun outside my window. My name is Whitney Ham. I work for VCU RRTC. I kind of actually serve on two fronts. So we have two divisions within the center. We have the business connection side, and then we have the Autism Center for Excellence. And I have the pleasure of getting to work on both sides. So I actually began in this field over a decade ago now as a job coach. It was my internship for grad school, working on a project search site, identifying what supports facilitate employment for transition-aged youth with autism. So have been in the employment transition field for quite a while. Found out that I really liked working with this population, enjoy individuals with autism, and also that I really had an interest in applied behavior analysis. So went ahead and also got my BCBA. So I'm now a board certified behavior analyst, and I continue to work in employment, but I also work with younger children and students as well in the elementary school through the secondary setting. And our plan for today, after that quick little meet and greet for me, is just to talk a little bit about how we can facilitate independence for students of all ages and ability levels, and how we can start to prepare for transition, really starting in preschool and starting to look at examples of transition activities across grade levels. I know that it's hard for you, you guys aren't able to come off mute, but I do have a few discussion sections in here where I would love for you guys to just type into the chat room. Some of this content may be redundant or familiar, and some of it might seem brand new. So I really enjoy an interactive audience as much as we can arrange to make that happen. So please, feel free to kind of type in the chat questions and feedback, things like that. The plan, if you guys now wouldn't mind just typing in the chat room, if you are comfortable with that, to share your role in supporting transition and or students with disabilities, and just give us one word that describes your feelings around transition. And I'm just going to backtrack a little bit. So while you guys are typing in the chat room, our plan after this little introduction is really to just explore transition across the grade levels. So we'll be doing some exploration in preschool, elementary, middle, and high school, and talking a little bit about what that transition to adult services looks like, and also a little bit about those adult service providers specifically. And then throughout this discussion today, we are going to have opportunities for you all to participate again in that chat room. So okay, I see some numbers going up.
Yeah, do you see, I was gonna say, can you see the chat? I would be happy to read these out for us.
Let's see what we've got here. Okay, parent, one word, prepare. All right. Well, thank you. Hopefully this presentation will help get you there. And as Katie said at the end, I know that we have some upcoming presentations that are also going to focus on transition. So, oh, this is great. We have a Voc Rehab counselor on the team. Well, I really look forward to hearing your feedback throughout this presentation. And we have quite a few VR counselors on here. That's exciting. Priority. I agree. Priority and also collaboration. So I think your input, particularly as we get to the middle and high school sections, would be wonderful to hear. High school paraeducator, anxious. Yeah. Anxious describes a lot of things these days, but it certainly does describe transition. And for the parents on the call, as we go through this, if you would like to just share where your students currently are in terms of transition or what grade level they're in, that would be great too.
I see a lot of excited as the word.
Okay.
Empowering.
Fun. Wow. Okay. I'm trying to get through all of this. Social skills. Yes. Okay. A speech pathologist. We're going to talk a little bit about communication today. So I'm glad we have some experts on the call because I'm far from it. Okay. Oh, I see a DARS meeting in 2 weeks. So what's nice is that this is such an awesome opportunity because we talk a lot about building those relationships between educators and parents, students, and also outside service providers. So this call actually seems kind of like a miniature version of the collaboration that we are looking for to support transition out in the community. And I think it's great that we have some Voc Rehab counselors on here. So again, please participate in the chat room as much as you can, and we might be able to facilitate some interaction or dialogue between the different service providers. I feel like we should have done circles and filled this in as it was coming through, but I do see some positives, especially from service providers in terms of empowerment and excitement. And from parents, I'm seeing a little bit on the more negative end, that anxiety, that concern. So I think coming onto this call, hopefully you will leave feeling like you have some resources or some actionable steps that parents can take, and also a broader awareness of those service providers that we can start to build relationships with and understand what adult services look like as you exit high school. Okay, thank you so much for preparation. Okay, preparation, priority, those are powerful words. So I have to start off. So when I mentioned those two sides of the Employment Center of the RRTC, the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center, we do, one of our main roles is to conduct research and then make sure that we are sharing what we're finding out about the research with the community at large. And so it's in our best interest to just take a little status check about what employment currently looks like for individuals with autism. And for the parents on the call and also the service providers, we do know that our students with autism tend to fare the worst in terms of employment outcomes as they transition out of high school. So they tend to have lower employment rates than individuals with other types of disabilities. Their placement, and so we have different types of employment options as you transition out of high school. The primary focus, not only at the center, but also from a legislative perspective, is on integrated employment, specifically competitive integrated employment, where you are in the community working with and without individuals with disabilities, around typically developing individuals. You have opportunities for advancement, and very importantly, you are also making a competitive wage. So we know that the employment outcomes, unfortunately, are not increasing at the rate that we would like to see them in integrated employment. And so that's part of the reason for these discussions, and also the collaboration amongst the different service providers, and a focus on starting transition early. And early doesn't necessarily refer to high school or middle school. It refers to preschool and elementary school as well. One of the reasons that employment is so beneficial and so necessary, and we borrow this actually from research on typically developing individuals, is that there are lots of benefits of employment, and that is to include financial benefits, benefits to quality of life, financial independence, economic independence, access to, and some of those more abstract concepts related to social and emotional well-being. We know that employment provides access to achieve a lot of those outcomes, and individuals with autism who inherently might have some social and communication challenges, employment provides a nice venue for them to not become isolated as they transition out of high school. And this is just a visual that compares individuals with autism to individuals in other disability categories and their employment outcomes. In this slide here, I did embed some links. Will take you to some of the more recent statistics on employment outcomes for individuals with autism. So this is some of the research that we conducted. It feels like it was yesterday, but the date tells me that it was just a little over 7 years ago. But some of the main pathways to employment, especially as our students enter into high school, are looking at different internship options, and then also supported employment and customized employment. Customized employment really grew out of supported employment, and but with more of an emphasis on ensuring that we are customizing employment positions based on an individual's strengths and interests, and also the needs of the employment sector. The supported employment piece really focuses on providing long-term support for individuals so that they can access that competitive and integrated employment rather than looking at isolated or sheltered settings. And those internships, a focus that can occur over the summer. They can start in high school, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But that's really identifying those work experiences that you can start to gain skills and practice those hard and soft skills that can help you to obtain and maintain employment. So these are actually, I built this slide with a colleague of mine when we were job coaches. So instead of out of the mouths of babes, this is out of the mouths of job coaches. And so these were just some of the skills that we consistently found that we were addressing and really focusing on for individuals, specifically interns with autism, who were still considered high school students, but were spending their last year of high school fully embedded in an employment site rather than in their designated home school. So some of the specific work skills: following break and lunch schedules. So knowing when it's okay and not okay to take a break, when it's okay to take your lunch and snack breaks, following your task lists and transitioning independently throughout the employment site as a whole, and then also specifically within your internship site. Task initiation. So really reducing that dependence on the physical proximity or verbal prompting of a support person, such as a teacher or a paraprofessional in your setting, to constantly remind you what to do. Interactions with the public and also with coworkers. So one thing there's many things that are different between school and work, but one thing that's very different is that when you're in a work setting, you have access to all sorts of individuals, from babies to adults to elderly individuals. And so really being able to appropriately interact and respond to individuals of all types is an important skill to acquire and practice. And also the ability to stay on task and focus, again, without being dependent on somebody else to support you through those skills. Then we have some of the skills that start to feel a bit more behavioral. So the ability to recognize or identify when you're becoming frustrated and the appropriate steps to take when you are in a public setting to handle that skill. Recognizing those private versus public conversation topics. So that kind of goes back to those interactions between the community, whether it's coworkers or patrons at whatever employment site that you're on. So appropriate conversation topics. How to handle when you make a mistake, because that's tough for all of us. So what happens if you do something wrong and you require some type of correction? Again, that break time. So that becomes really important. And I'm sure you guys have been exposed to this in other lunch and learns, but handling unstructured break time appropriately can feel that can be a dangerous time for individuals with autism. So a lot of times we talk about how, even though it's your break time, it's your relaxation, how can we structure that time to ensure that we're handling that appropriately and know what to do, because that might look different at work than it does when you're at home in your living room. And then those professional behaviors. So making it very clear what's expected professionally. So I wanted to hear again, you guys were so great in the chat room at the beginning. So I wanted us to take a minute and share what your first work experience was, and what was one thing that you learned in that first work experience that maybe you still keep with you. My first work experience was actually as a lifeguard. And I remember that somebody was sick in the bathroom, and it was a little girl, and she was really upset about it. And I took the time to clean it up. And I just remember that the little girl's mom took me aside later and told me that she was so appreciative that I didn't make a big deal out of it. And I was very empathetic to her child and handled that very nicely rather than getting really grumpy or grossed out about it. So I think for me, it wasn't really a hard skill other than being able to clean up something that's not fun to clean up, but it was more the ability to understand what professionalism was and how to apply it in a situation that was a bit uncomfortable. So I think I see some more coming in. Okay, the chat box is going up. Katie, can you see it or do you need me to? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I just noticed. Other than babysitting, this is from one of the folks. It says worked at a Woolco. I'm not sure what that is, but it says that they learned that my efforts were appreciated. And that is something that usually that first job, you see that contribution.
Mhm.
Public pool learned not everyone takes work seriously and learn to be patient.
Mhm.
Oh, Woolco is a retail store. Just help me out there a little. Thank you.
Maybe that's in a different region then, because I'm
Maybe
not
so.
familiar with that either.
Yeah. Restaurant work, learn to be flexible because you could be hired for something and hold on, it's scrolling, always had to do something else. So yeah, kind of learning that even though you were hired to do one thing, there were other things that you may be asked to do. Paper route on their bike, learned responsibility, even early mornings when I wanted to stay in bed or it was rainy or cold. Babysitting, learned about having a great attitude.
You know, I'm really glad that you guys are putting in babysitting because I stand corrected. That was my first job. Was babysitting.
It was mine too.
So as Katie's looking, and Katie, if you want to step in and share as things continue to come out in the chat room, one thing that I wanted to point out, so in the research, we talk a lot about those hard skills versus those soft skills. So the hard skills, again, referring to those specific job related skills. So is it stocking? Is it data entry? Is it some sort of technical skill related to managing computers or engineering? Healthcare, you have all sorts of really technical skills. But what I'm hearing from you guys, so hard work, patience, responsibility, being flexible. The flexibility one makes me laugh because I just recall very specifically a lesson that we did at Project Search on flexibility. So those are those soft skills. And that is what we are finding repeatedly in the literature, that those soft skills is what helps you get the job. And most importantly, it's what helps you to keep that job. So if you have some of those soft skills and you can demonstrate them, if you make a mistake or maybe need a little extra support in the hard skill department, that's more likely to occur when you have the soft skills, when you have the relationships. The other thing about those soft skills is that they tend to be a little more abstract, right? So what does it mean to be responsible? What does that look like? What does it mean to be flexible? What does that look like? And individuals with autism are learners who tend to be very concrete. And so as service providers, as parents, as educators, paraprofessionals, and even our VR staff on here who are supporting individuals in job sites, it's coming together to identify those important skills and also break them down, task analyze them so that we know what they look like, so we can start instilling those skills like responsibility, flexibility with routines early on. So that's just kind of the first work experience, from what I'm gathering, is not necessarily that related to what you're doing now as an adult. But we still, those skills that we acquired and those hard lessons that we learned early on have helped to inform or not inform, create the employees that we are today. So, and that started, decades ago now for all of us. So that's just something to consider as we start to move through the presentation. So here we have just those predictive factors of employment success. So those social skills, we just talked about that a little bit, but reciprocal conversations, greetings, farewells, how to engage in the break room, what's okay and not okay to talk about, work behaviors. So again, some of those rote or more concrete tasks that are a little bit easier to break down than the soft skills like stocking printers, putting data into Excel spreadsheets, making presentations, things like that. Self-determination skills. I think self-determination is a real hot topic nowadays. And so working on those, the ability to advocate for yourself in whatever manner that may look like, starting early on, and also to really start to explore those interests and preferences so that we can start to develop those post-secondary goals with the individual with a disability, not for them. And then self-regulation. So in the very beginning, we talked about how in employment, we really don't want to be quite as dependent on the physical proximity of someone to support us and keep us on track. So we want to be working with our students to learn to self-regulate themselves. And sometimes that involves teaching them what self-regulation looks like, and then gradually fading away as they start to acquire those skills so that we can see where more support or is needed from us and where we can start to fade away as parents, as other types of caregivers, educators, and adult service providers as well. So what we're going to start to look at now is how we can really foster these skills and, most importantly, experiences early on. So starting in preschool and elementary school is not too early to better prepare for post-secondary success. Okay, so in preschool, we're starting to transition more. So maybe we received some early intervention services in the home environment. We had some in-home therapists coming in or got to participate in different programs. And then we're going to start to transition to preschool and a new environment with different educators, different expectations. We're starting to look more like school, less like home in our playroom and where we are comfortable. And so in preschool, we're going to focus on communication and collaboration. And so this is where those strong relationships become so important between the educators, if you're receiving occupational therapy or you have the support of an SLP, and the parents to start to identify what supports are working and where additional support is needed. So let's say at school, you're starting to work on toilet training. The teacher has started to build some visual support so the student is aware of their expectations in the bathroom. Maybe they're going on a certain timeline or time frame throughout the day. So making sure we're communicating that with the parents so that they can follow up at home. And this is where, we tread lightly because we don't want to push parents or educators past their comfort zone. But I know from my experience as a mom that it was my child's early or the daycare providers that were telling me that my child was ready for toilet training. I wasn't necessarily ready for it. So that's where that communication and collaboration and really fostering that rapport and dialogue is so important so that you can start to build these skills across different environments, because that's also where their consistency. So it's the same at school as it is at home. And also that routine is becoming so, and repetition are so important for all learners, but particularly for learners with autism. So again, we use toilet training as an example, which isn't necessarily a job skill, but it is certainly nice to be able to go on a job site and be independent with your toilet training. But those routines and procedures. So anything that we can make routine, whether it's eating or whether it's break time, and also that we can support through the use of a visual support that is not a person. That's where we want to start supporting our learners with autism, because they tend to process things, not everyone, everyone is individual, but what we know is that in general, learners with autism tend to be very strong visual learners, which is why even if they have strong verbal skills, visual supports are not a barrier and they aren't going to hold anybody back. We use visual supports all the time, whether you have a disability or you're considered a typically developing individual. So starting to identify those visual supports and how we can use those to set up independence for our young kiddos. Also starting to identify what a student's sensory needs might be and what supports a student might need to calm themselves, so that we can start to identify when we need to employ a calming strategy and what type of access to a break or sensory diet a learner with autism might benefit from, so that they can transition to more integrated environments and succeed and not feel uncomfortable. Working to identify those preferences and strengths cannot be cannot start early enough, because and it's not that you have to know that you want to be a doctor or a nurse or a construction worker in preschool, but starting to identify what the learner gravitates to and where they like spending their time, because that can become a good pathway for natural environment teaching, and also to identify or to build on some of those pre-vocational skills that can help them as they transition to elementary, middle, and high school, where those expectations become a little harder. Here we also see, so really supporting students with a functional communication system. And I believe we have some SLPs on the call today. So their support and input is integral, because if we don't have a strong communication system, then what starts to happen is we start to see some of those interfering or challenging behaviors. And if we can identify a functional communication system early on, then we can not only prevent problem behavior from occurring, but we're also going to support that student to expand their communication skills across their lifetime, but also to not be as dependent on their parents or, again, those service providers, to be with them as they integrate out in the home, school, and community. And with those functional communication systems, keeping in mind that communication occurs in all different forms. And I know you guys had a wonderful SLP on, I think maybe a couple weeks ago, who probably spoke much more eloquently to functional communication. But again, communication can occur through the use of a device. It can occur through body language. It can occur through the use of visual supports, but it needs to be something that the individual is comfortable using and that doesn't require too much effort on the part of the learner. So we don't see those behaviors. And also so that everyone who supports them is comfortable with that communication device and supporting it, again, across those different environments. So if you have a device at home, it needs to be used at school. And whatever that communication system looks like needs to be used consistently. And also here, this you're going to hear choices a lot, but that self-advocacy. So working with the learner to make choices, to express their preferences and their dislikes. So then you're kind of getting into that self-determination as well. Elementary and preschool, pretty similar, but in elementary school, again, you might start to see some higher expectations, not only academically, but also behaviorally. And you're also going to start to see more transitions. And in elementary school, it might very well be that those transitions are occurring within the classroom, but transitions to and from school, to and from different areas of the classroom, and preparing for those transitions are a really good way to start facilitating that independence early on. It is also a really good way to start to practice what types of supports are most helpful for our students. So whether that's a laminated piece of paper, whether it's on a clipboard or a folder with Velcro, whether it's on a device, if they really excel with electronics. So whatever form is most useful and most meaningful to the student, let's start there. And again, that way they don't have to have the teacher or the paraprofessional verbally prompting them throughout the day. Maybe the prompt is a check your schedule. And then maybe we don't even need that. Maybe we transition to just a timer and the students start to independently become aware of their expectations, what materials they might need for those different areas, what hygiene, if they need to wash their hands as they're transitioning or preparing for lunch, little things like that. Again, a focus on those routines so that we have consistency across environments and the students know what to expect. That not only facilitates independence, it also decreases anxiety. Continuing to explore student interests so that we can start to identify activities where we might start to build independence, but also to explore some of those pre-vocational skills and interests. And visual supports. constantly going back to those visual supports. So that is an evidence-based practice that has a lot of bang for your buck. This is a really nice article that I think we could probably get you guys access to, but it starts to talk about community-based instruction and how, again, that doesn't need to wait until high school for us to start to look at instruction that can occur out in the community. And this one actually occurred within an elementary school setting. But what is so nice about it is that a lot of these enterprises that were identified in a school setting could also work in middle school and high school as well. What else I really like about this example here is that this was for students who were mainly spending their school day in a self-contained setting and also had pretty significant behavioral and communication needs. And they were still able to identify all of these different activities for them to participate in throughout the school year. So things like stocking the teacher's school or coffee supply bin, stocking condiments, starting to learn how to plant, water, and care for a garden, running the farmer's market, organizing the lost and found, assembling SOL bags, feeding the birds. So again, we can see how those skills could also be needed as you transition into elementary and high school. And the way that they started to teach these skills was they started in the classroom with the support of an OT and also with the paraprofessionals. And then they expanded these tasks into the environments in which they would occur. So maybe the break room, the cafeteria, outside on the playground, et cetera. So this to me was just great because this was for, I believe, kindergarten through 5th grade, where these skills were identified and practiced. And some of the skills that they were able to address through this community-based instruction, so working on literacy, numeracy, which sounds weird now that I say it, it's easier to read, practicing social skills, independence with functional independent living skills, and also just focusing on, hey, we started in the classroom, just a small classroom setting, then we expanded into the school building at large, and then we were also able to go out into the community. So that farmer's market, for example. Another thing that I think is important is sometimes when we think about math or reading, we think about traditional academic skills. And while those are important, such as handwriting, as we look at transitioning to the community at large, I think we can also take a very realistic perspective on skills and what our post-secondary goals are. So if handwriting is very non-preferred, if fine motor skills are very challenging, then maybe we focus on making sure that an individual can sign their initials, or we focus just on their signature. And I think we can all think throughout the day, we don't really have to use handwriting that often anymore because we have so much technology with us. So just to think about as far as math skills, addition and subtraction. So maybe that's very difficult, but maybe what becomes a little bit easier is learning how to use a calculator. So taking those academic skills, but applying a transition focus so that we can start to focus on prioritize what might be most important and meaningful for that learner and also their educational and support team as they identify your post-secondary goals. And I think you guys have received a full presentation on this if you were able to join or could access the recording on AAC or also on assistive technology. But again, taking a team approach, but also just identifying the importance of this type of technology for communication and also for independence. And being aware that we talked about that relationship between service providers, that collaboration, that communication. This is incredibly important when you are learning how to use a device and how to support a student to learn and acquire the skills, to use a device across those home, school, and community settings. But there's also a lot of research to show that when a student has a device or employs consistently some assistive technology, that they tend to have better post-school outcomes. So that's something to consider. So that's a little bit about what elementary and preschool can look like. And now we're going to talk a little bit about middle school. I want to pause for just a minute because I have talked a lot. Do we have any questions based on what we just shared for preschool and elementary school? I'll just do a quick pause.
There's nothing currently in the chat. I was just gonna drop quickly into the chat where folks can access those archived presentations, like you were mentioning, the one on AAC and the communication piece, just so that folks can have that to take a look at after this presentation if they want. And if there are any questions, I don't see anything coming in yet.
Okay.
They're going to hold them for the end, but.
Well, I just feel like I went on like a very long talking routine. So I just wanted to pause for a minute and see if you guys, if anything struck a chord or you had a specific comment. So again, we'll keep an eye on the chat. So please feel free.
Definitely.
So here's a little snapshot of middle school. And again, the state of the states, middle school, what we do know is that the majority of research on transition has been conducted with high school students rather than younger learners. However, we know that high school is too late. So we really need to start preparing for transition earlier. The research tells us that when the earlier you start transition activities, for example, in middle school, then the more likely the student is to obtain employment as they transition to adulthood, and also that they require less support financially from service providers to obtain and maintain employment. And also that we really, teachers, middle school teachers, and I imagine that elementary teachers would mimic this finding, that they don't necessarily feel that they have the knowledge to support transition-based activities. So that's kind of a gap in the literature, and something that we all need to address is how we can support our educators to feel comfortable focusing on transition, and also communicating to parents about transition activities and what can support successful transition. Some of the things to focus on in middle school, just continuing to expand on those independent skills, on the ability of the student to transition, to make choices and to advocate for themselves, starting to look at increasing participation in their IEP meetings, starting to really focus on exploring careers and what adulthood looks like, and starting to identify what a student's likes, preferences, also what their dislikes are, and where their support needs are, so that we can start to prepare them for transitioning to different environments, and also more integrated environments with less support from adults. Also starting to not only those soft skills that we talked about earlier related to social skills, but also starting to focus on independent and personal hygiene, ensuring that we are preparing our students with an appropriate sex education curriculum so that they are advocating for themselves and learning how to keep themselves safe. Because again, we are trying to prepare them to integrate into employment environments and community environments without being as dependent on their caregivers. Also, those school-based enterprises, starting to get creative with those school-based enterprises and identifying where we can start to focus on those job skills and identifying what supports are needed so that they're successful and independent in those schools, those activities. So some of that success in middle school really begins in elementary school, and in ensuring a successful transition from elementary to middle. That can start with starting to go on tours of the middle school, maybe starting to sit in and observe some of those classes, or the educators that you're going to be working with. If you're going to have new electives or resources, starting to explore those activities again. So we are starting to build those choice-making skills and those self-advocacy skills. Also being aware of the physical and cognitive development. Middle school is a time of big change. So making sure that we're working with our students to identify and be comfortable with those changes, and also learn the appropriate skills to start to take care of themselves as much as is feasible for that individual. So in middle school, we're also looking at what's happening after middle school. So what does the transition to high school look like? What does life after high school look like? And starting to have those conversations early with our students and with our parents, and starting to lay that foundation of what adult services looks like. Right now, what we hear from parents is that it feels like a service cliff and the doors kind of slam shut when you age out of high school. So if we can start talking about that transition and who those adult service providers, shout out to the VR representatives on this call, who they are and how they can support us is going to be very important, just so it doesn't feel completely new. And that transition planning. So in middle school, we can really start to look at interest inventories and also career assessment inventories that not only start to expose you to what different types of careers look like, but also start to help you identify where your interests may lie so that you can start to conduct some further research. Starting to develop goals that might be specifically related to our post-secondary goals, whether that's going to be employment or further education, or possibly a little bit of both, so that we are acquiring the skills that are going to be needed, and also starting to look at funding streams to help us achieve those goals. These are just some examples of, again, I mentioned that most of the research is on high school students when we talk about transition, but these are some examples of transition assessments that have been normed for middle school students. So I put this in here mainly as a resource if you wanted to start to explore this with your students' education team. We talked about assessment and that career exploration, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Discovering Me, which is a career assessment that has been supported through the Virginia Department of Education. And Discovering Me was really developed through our partner organization, the Center on Transition Innovations, which you guys are going to hear from in a couple of weeks, I believe. But Discovering Me really adapts and one of those pathways to employment from the beginning that we talked about, customized employment, and adapted it for middle school students because they were finding that trying to take adult models of employment and apply them to school age students wasn't quite working. And so they just made some modifications. Just to go back for a minute, I did want to talk a little bit about this paradigm shift because in the beginning of the presentation, we talked about how employment does not look the way that we want it to right now. The statistics aren't matching what our expectations and hopes are for all individuals with disability, particularly individuals with autism. And so we're really undergoing this paradigm shift in that we are presuming competence and we are presuming that everybody that wants to work can work. And is capable of engaging in an integrated employment setting based on their skills and abilities. So Discovering Me, it occurs across a few school years, beginning in middle school, and then can support the student as they transition and throughout high school. But that first meeting year really consists of 3 meetings to identify, collect information amongst all types of service providers. You build a very supportive network to support the student. And then also starting to explore career interests, identifying those workplace readiness skills, and also looking at career clusters to start to prepare that student for transition. This is an example when you do that first meeting and you're collecting information. You can see here that you have this 4 square. You have the student's strengths and contributions. You have the student's interests, their conditions for success, and also challenges to consider. And I wanted to put an example of this because this really is a nice visual depiction of a lot of those skills we've been talking about. So building on a student's interests, starting to support the student to make choices, self-determination and advocacy, and starting to explore those students' interests and how we can expand upon those. Also taking into consideration that just because we may have challenges or specific conditions for success, that doesn't need to be seen as a barrier to employment. We all have conditions in which that we set up for ourselves to optimize our productivity or for us to feel most successful. If we had more time, I would ask you guys to share your conditions for success in the chat room. But my main point or takeaway point here is that if we need a visual support, or if we need quiet time, or we need to decrease the level of stimulation or light in our environment, that's not a barrier to our participation in employment or integrated settings. We all, and I think the difference is, as typically developing individuals, we all have the liberty of advocating or vocalizing our needs. And sometimes we need to support our learners with individuals or our learners with disabilities to advocate and also identify what some of their challenges or conditions for success may be. And that's all just supporting their transition to adulthood. These slides, these are those workplace readiness skills that were identified by the state of Virginia. And so through that Discovering Me process, you actually do this assessment and identify whether or not these are strengths or areas of weakness that we need to work on as they transition to adulthood in high school for the participants of this process. And again, I just wanted to point out that some of these that we talked about in the beginning, so that positive work ethic or that integrity. So those are some of those skills that we might need to break down and make concrete for how we can teach those skills. These are some of the career clusters that you might start to explore based on the results of interest inventories. So you can see there's education and training, which all of us on this call can identify with. You also have health sciences, agriculture. So based on these possible career clusters, when you participate in Discovering Me, you start to build work experiences or activities in the home, school, and community that can help that student to gain access and experiences within these career clusters. So if you think this top left one, agriculture, food, and natural resources, so the gardening CBI or the farmers market CBI would be great activities that would fall within this category. Let's see. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. So a little bit about the high school focus, continuing to give students opportunities to advocate for themselves and make choices based on their transition goals and based on their strengths and interests. Starting to focus more and more on those community-based work experiences or school-based work experiences. There have definitely been more school-based work experiences in this era of COVID than we would like, not quite as easy to get out into the community. But you know what we always loved about Project Search, we always chose business settings such as hospitals or government centers that are kind of a microcosm of the community at large. So just because you're in a hospital doesn't mean that you're in health sciences. You can still be in engineering, you can still be in technology, counseling. There are all sorts of food services. There are all sorts of other industries that take place within these large sectors, and schools are pretty similar. So within a school, you can also identify those different types of career clusters and build activities within those. As you transition to high school, ensuring that depending on that student's post-secondary goals, whether it's employment or education, that we're spending more and more time in activities that are related to those, and possibly not as much time in activities that are not directly related to our post-secondary goals. This is the flow of student services, and I have this visual in here because it always saddens me when I'm in a school setting or in a high school setting and a parent isn't aware of some of those adult service providers. So whether it's vocational rehabilitation or even community service boards. So when parents aren't aware of some of those key adult service providers that can help to bridge that transition from education to adulthood. And here is a plug for the Virginia Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services. And for the VR providers on the call, if you want to add anything in the chat room for participants on the call, I just wanted to provide a link, particularly for the caregivers, to get on the VADAR's website and explore all of the various and also continually expanding services that they provide to students and students with disabilities and also their caregivers. But one of the main points here is that vocational rehabilitation is the bridge to employment services and to helping to facilitate that transition to employment and making the connections with the service providers, such as job coaches that are going to support students with disabilities to access employment. These are links to examples of transition programs that are more available in the high school setting or in the college setting. The pre-employment transition services are a somewhat new activity that is now occurring to increase collaboration between vocational rehabilitation providers and also our education systems. ACEIT is a program for individuals with disabilities to explore and experience college, and that is through our neighbor organization of the Center on Transition Innovations. And then also Project Search, which is an internship-based program that is available to students with disabilities while they are still in high school. And it's a modified last year, where instead of going to their home school, they're rotating through internship rotations in community employment settings. Here's just a visual for the different individuals who can support our students with disabilities in their transition to adulthood. So parents and guardians, the students themselves, we've talked a lot about choice and advocacy, vocational rehabilitation service providers, and also service providers within the school setting. So our teachers, our paraprofessionals, and also our transition specialists, our coordinators that are in the school setting. I know different school divisions have different terms for individuals who support transition. This slide here just we very quickly went through preschool through high school. But I wanted to just highlight some of the common themes that we're seeing as far as activities that support a successful transition experience for our students. So that focus on independence, that focus on teaching the student to advocate for themselves, which requires a strong communication system and the ability to learn how to express your likes and dislikes. And also your needs, and the ability to self-regulate, to reduce that dependence on our caregivers and our educators as we integrate and perform hard or soft skills out in the community. Some of the support, so the communication support, so making sure that we have a strong communication system in place that can help us communicate with others that might be outside of our close network, so our close friends or our educators, our family members, so that we can learn how to interact with individuals in the community. Visual supports, so that we're reducing dependence on other individuals, and then also supporting independence. Experiences, so those experiences that help us experience and prepare for work at home, in the school, and in the community. Connections, so connections with different service providers, connections with adult service providers, with occupational therapists, with SLPs, and strong rapport and communication between the school environment and the home environment. So a focus on assessment, and not assessment in a scary way, but assessment to explore our interests and preferences and identify what post-secondary might look like for us. Again, if we're going to focus on attaining a job or focusing on applying to college. And then expectations. So making sure that we have high expectations of our students and high expectations of our parents, that our students, if they want to work, that they can work, and that they are capable of obtaining a job that is integrated, and that's based on their interests and preferences. And here's a slide. I really wanted to highlight the CTI resources. They have some great resources for parents. All of them are linked within this slide. And then there's also an upcoming presentation from CTI. So Katie, this might be a good opportunity to stop for questions and for you to share about upcoming presentations, but I just quickly wanted to say thank you. I spoke an awful lot, but before you leave, I'd love to hear something that you either learned in this presentation that you would like to start to implement at home or at school, or something you'd like to receive more information on as we plan for future lunch and learns.
Right. Okay, I did have a question pop here into the chat for us, and that is just about, when you maybe haven't heard about some of these services prior to graduating from high school, is it too late to access? And I believe one of our DARS friends may have put in there that, students can apply to services with DARS after they've already graduated. I think it's just some of those pre-graduation things that may not be available anymore, like Project Search. Is that correct, Whitney?
What do you mean not available anymore?
Like if they have already graduated from high school, they can't go into
Gotcha.
Project Search.
Okay. Yep. So like Project Search wouldn't be an option, but this is so great. I love that we had a parent who was able to ask a question and a voc rehab provider was able to answer it. So yes, even if Project Search is not available, I think just like the VR member on this call said, you can apply for DARS services at any time. Even if you have already exited high school, you can also start to look at your community service boards. If you are after high school, I think, or if you're still in high school, but maybe in your last year, even knowing some of these key phrases or the names of adult service providers or agencies can be helpful. Okay.
I'm just dropping in the chat some information about how folks can learn about upcoming Lunch and Learns also. The next one we have coming up is March 17th, and that will be related to special needs planning. And the VCU ACE website is going to take you, that link will take you right out to where you can register for that one. You will also, if you keep an eye on that page, you'll see that we have a few other items that are coming up soon. We have a social emotional needs coming up on March 31st. And then we're going to head back to talking about transition and getting ready for life after high school on April 14th. And that will be with our Center for Transition Innovations. So kind of, I feel like Whitney did a good starting point saying how transition doesn't have to wait until that 10th grade mark. We really can start off the bat thinking about why, what types of transferable and skills, pre-vocational skills we can work on even from preschool. And then I think the CTI team will take you to that after high school transition, even in more depth. Let me see if there's some more questions here.
So Karen Adams just put a thought about the division needing to do, school divisions doing a better job of providing these resources to parents. And I think that that's some really good feedback to provide to your division, Karen. And I do know, at least within our specific area, we're in Richmond, I am starting to see transition as a hot topic right now, as it should be, because we spend the majority of our lives in employment, not in school, or in adulthood rather. Are starting to get very creative about expanding their transition services. So I think that that's a sign in the positive direction, but we need more and more communication with parents. And I think COVID has made that even more difficult as a parent myself to really understand what's happening in schools.
Definitely. Also, we did have somebody drop the Virginia DARS phone numbers into the chat. So if anybody wants to scroll up and write those down, those might be good to just have on hand. Also just mentioned that every county in Virginia would have a point of contact for parents and providers for within DARS. And other states would also. So if we have anybody joining from another state, just do a quick Google search and look for your local voc rehab in your state. And any other questions for Whitney today as we're just wrapping up here? We've had a lot of interactivity here in the chat. I appreciate it so much.
I do too. And I'm really glad that we had some VR representatives on our call.
Okay, a lot of thank yous. It was great.
Thank you guys. I'm really glad that you guys were participatory. That makes it so much better. And I thank you for taking the time to join us today. And we're rolling into the end of the week. So I hope everyone enjoys their Thursday, Friday, and their weekend. Yeah, I saw a heart pop up. I feel ya.
Love that.
I know you guys can't unmute. So I appreciate those that were willing to type.
Yes. Okay.